Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
America woke up to a new world, one without Canadian copper. One document, one signature, and $4.2 billion disappeared from the American balance sheet overnight. But what is even more frightening is not the amount. It is the chain reaction that is now impossible to stop. Copper, a metal that is rarely thought about, suddenly became the epicenter of a global economic storm. It all started with Donald Trump's loud announcement from August 1st, a 50% tariff on copper imports. The goal was to protect national security, but in an attempt to protect itself, Washington has shot itself in the foot.
the objectives of Canada's new government have been constant. First, to protect Canadian workers and their families.
Canada, which supplied almost half of all copper to the US, did not remain silent. Without loud words and political theatrics, it froze contracts, cut off supplies, and turned to Asia and Europe. From now on, Japan, China, and South Korea will receive the same copper that used to go to Detroit and Texas. Production chains that took decades to build have been broken. This is no longer just a trade dispute. It is a strategic reversal of an entire country and possibly a turning point in the history of American industry.
Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
Copper futures soared to a record 13% in one day. In London, on the contrary, prices went down. The difference between the American and world prices for copper reached 25%. And this is ideal ground for speculation, imbalances, and financial chaos. For factories, construction sites, and car companies, this means only one thing: shortages and rising prices. The production of electric cars, the construction of residential buildings, and the modernization of power grids have all slowed down. Copper is the artery of modern infrastructure, and now it is blocked.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
But that's not the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is that America is not ready for independence. Domestic copper processing volumes are negligible. Factories are closing. There are no reserves. Construction companies are raising estimates, car companies are cutting budgets, and energy companies are requesting tariff increases. And all these expenses are already starting to flow into one source: your bills. For electricity, for a new car, for home repairs. Meanwhile, Canada is not just defending itself. It is on the offensive. $1.8 billion is being invested in the construction of new ports, new processing facilities, and new routes. It is no longer a supplier, it is a player that no longer depends on the will of the White House. And if the US hoped to become self-sufficient, it instead found itself excluded from the supply chain that it itself destroyed.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher, 16% currently.
This is not just a story about metal. It is a story about how one tariff can turn into a national crisis, how a political decision can turn into an economic trap, and how those who were considered the weak link suddenly begin to dictate terms. In this issue, we reveal the whole truth about how the copper trade war changed the rules of the game. Who really won? Why is the dollar losing ground? And where will the copper redistribution of the world lead? Stay with us, it's only going to get tougher. August 1st, 2025, went down in history not as a day of strengthening the American economy, but as the moment when the US undermined its own position in one of the most important sectors: copper supplies. It was on this day that a new tariff signed by Donald Trump came into force, imposing a 50% duty on all copper imports. The White House loudly proclaimed the need to restore strategic independence and declared copper a material vital to national security. This was not just an economic move, it was a demonstrative act of protectionism aimed at reformatting global raw material flows in favor of domestic production. But something went wrong. Copper, which Americans were accustomed to thinking of as something routine, hidden in walls, cables, and engines, suddenly found itself at the forefront of a geoeconomic conflict, the consequences of which are only now beginning to be felt.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
At first, the Trump administration expected a typical scenario. American manufacturers would support the move, investors would take it as a signal to increase domestic processing, and allies would swallow it. But just 48 hours after the tariff came into effect, it became clear that the US had overestimated its influence and underestimated the determination of its neighbors. Panic ensued on the stock and commodity markets. The price of copper on US exchanges jumped to $5.95 per pound, an all-time high. Wall Street analysts instantly recorded losses of over $4.2 billion in the trade balance due to the immediate rise in contract prices and the suspension of supplies. But that was only the first blow. The response from Ottawa was not long in coming. On the third day after the tariffs were announced, the Canadian government officially suspended all existing contracts for copper exports to the US. And although this decision initially appeared to be temporary, a much more ambitious plan was taking shape behind the scenes. The Canadian Ministry of Natural Resources announced a strategic reorientation of supplies in a closed meeting, equating copper with a critical asset in national industrial policy. Major mining companies from Glenna to Hudbay Minerals were instructed to curtail shipments to the US and rapidly restructure their logistics for the Asian and European markets. Within weeks, preliminary agreements were signed with South Korea, Japan, and India for multi-billion-dollar supplies, with guaranteed prices above the US level.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on US concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
This was not just revenge. It was a cold, precise calculation. Canada understood that, depending on the American market, it had played the role of a silent donor of resources for years, receiving only political pressure and unstable conditions in return. The new tariff gave it a reason to break out of this cycle. Domestically, a decision was made not only to revise the economic model of exports, but also to build infrastructure capable of replacing the US as the main market. By October 2025, the modernization of the Kitimat port in British Columbia had begun, designed to increase copper shipments tenfold. The construction was supported by a $1.8 billion investment package from the federal budget, a record for the country's raw materials sector. While Washington was trying to organize emergency consultations with industrial giants to figure out how to quickly make up for the deficit, Ottawa took things to a new level. Diplomatic channels were engaged. Canada's trade minister held a series of meetings in Seoul and Tokyo, signing framework agreements on supplies of strategic metals bypassing the North American region. Thus, Canada did not simply cease to be a donor, it began to turn into a direct competitor. While factories in the US began to suspend production due to a shortage of raw materials, Canada announced the creation of a new copper processing alliance with India and Australia. The main task of the alliance will be to build high-tech processing facilities in exporting countries to limit the West's influence on raw material chains. As part of a pilot project, a processing complex is already being built in the Indian port of Mundra, where Canadian copper will be delivered directly, bypassing the US and Mexico.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
At the same time, in the southern United States, the governor of Arizona made a strong statement: "We don't have the infrastructure or resources to process even half of the copper we need." This tariff is a blow to our state, and that was no exaggeration. In 2024 alone, the US imported more than 800,000 tons of copper, half of which came from Canada. The halt in supplies, coupled with the new tariffs, created a situation in which production costs began to rise almost daily. Companies in Detroit, Chicago, and Houston found that every new day of delay meant millions of dollars in losses. At the same time, the US was unable to quickly compensate for the loss. As of 2025, domestic copper processing capacity provided only about 5 to 6% of the country's needs. The largest processing plants were either closed or operating at a loss due to outdated equipment and a shortage of skilled personnel. Projects to expand processing in Nevada and New Mexico never made it past the drawing board due to lack of funding and environmental restrictions. Even in the event of emergency mobilization, the construction of new facilities would take at least 3 to 5 years. And all this time, the economy would suffer from a shortage of this key metal.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
In this context, Canada's decision to freeze exports was not just painful but systemically destructive. It showed that the U.S. is dependent on external suppliers, on foreign logistics chains, on allies that itself has turned away. And perhaps the most painful realization was that in a world where copper is not just a metal, but the nervous system of the entire digital infrastructure, political moves cannot be made without calculating the consequences, especially when it comes to partners who have a choice. The American establishment was caught off guard. Many in Congress, even among Republicans, began to publicly criticize Trump's decision. In an interview with CNN, a senator from Iowa called the tariff one of the most ill-conceived moves of the last decade. Experts from the Brookings Institution published an analytical note predicting that if the situation does not change in the next 6 months, the U.S. will lose its dominant position in the global copper top of ever. And judging by all appearances, that is exactly where things are headed.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The third wave of consequences caused by the copper tariff and Canada's response was the most devastating, not because it was the loudest, but because it hit where the economy has no armor: logistics, production chains, and specific sectors that ensure the functioning of the entire infrastructure. While the market reacted frantically to the news, American factories began to feel the real consequences in their raw materials and budgets. Disruptions in copper supplies caused disruptions not only in production, but also in planning. Companies that used to sign contracts a quarter in advance were now forced to revise their estimates every week. Copper became more than just a resource; it became a variable capable of disrupting the plans of billion-dollar industries. By mid-August, more than 340 manufacturing plants across the country, from Arizona to Illinois, had reported non-critical shutdowns. This euphemism concealed a very specific reality: assembly lines were stopped, workers were sent on unpaid leave, and orders were postponed indefinitely. The situation was even more critical in the electronics manufacturing segment. In California, 3 large assembly plants that supplied components for cloud data centers completely shut down due to a lack of copper foil and wiring. This caused a chain reaction. Delays in server equipment affected contracts with Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure, which in turn led to an increase in prices for cloud services. One step in the raw materials sector, and the cost of virtual space skyrocketed. Hardly anyone expected such an effect from a simple tariff.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
The energy sector began its own drama. Copper is a key component to transformers and high-voltage lines. Without it, it is impossible to modernize or even simply maintain the operability of power grids. By the end of August, Duke Energy, Southern Company, and Entergy had already submitted urgent requests to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to revise their tariff policy, arguing that prices for copper and related components had risen by 22 to 28% compared to the same period last year. In Texas, where a large-scale expansion of electric vehicle networks is underway, work has effectively been frozen. Contractors did not have the necessary amount of cable or the funds to purchase it at the new prices. Paradoxically, the tariff, adopted ostensibly for safety reasons, has jeopardized the energy independence of entire regions. However, the events in the construction industry caused the greatest resonance. According to the National Association of Home Builders, the cost of an average home in the Chicago, suburbs rose by $19,000 in August, solely due to the surge in prices for copper materials, wires, grounding, and connectors. Many developers began to freeze projects, especially in states where profitability was already on the verge of collapse: Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. Not only construction companies were affected, but also the banks that financed these projects. Mortgage rates went up, and insurers began to revise their rates. Copper, in the literal sense, became the element that permeated every aspect of the economy, right down to the cost per square meter of housing. The automotive industry, especially in the context of electric vehicles, faced a perfect storm. Each electric car contains about 80 kilograms of copper in batteries, motors, and cooling systems. Before the tariff was introduced, this metal cost $540 per unit, but now it costs over $850. This meant that every new car was losing money even before it reached the dealership. According to information leaked from factories, Tesla, Rivian, and Ford have already suspended 5 joint projects under the federal program to deploy charging infrastructure. And in Michigan, unions began to sound the alarm. Layoffs among technical staff became a daily reality. It was no longer about development plans, it was about survival.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
But the most frightening developments began to take place outside the headlines. Small and medium-sized companies without reserves or the ability to switch to alternative suppliers began to close. In Wisconsin, a 3-generation company that manufactured electrical components for elevators and escalators went out of business. In Oklahoma, a small transformer winding factory sent 120 people home for good. None of these stories made it into the mainstream media, but they demonstrated the true depth of the crisis. According to estimates by the U.S. Copper Industry Association, the sector's total losses exceeded $6.1 billion in just the first 2 months of the tariff. Meanwhile, major market players began to look for alternatives. General Electric reportedly signed an urgent contract with a Vietnamese copper cathode manufacturer, albeit at an inflated price. Schneider Electric announced the transfer of part of its production to Brazil, where access to Latin American raw materials is not yet restricted. Ironically, against the backdrop of U.S. attempts to achieve industrial independence, companies have begun to leave the country, taking jobs and investments with them. In August, major financial consortiums, including BlackRock and J.P. Morgan, set up working groups to analyze commodity risk with a particular focus on copper and rare earth metals. In private briefings, their analysts are already talking about the possible transition of major industries from engineering to telecommunications into a phase of structural deficit comparable to the oil crisis of the 1970s.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
And this is just the beginning. The inflationary consequences have not yet reached their full extent, but there are already signs of jumps in consumer prices. Cable for home electrical systems has risen in price by 17%. Even retail chains have begun to notice strange trends. Demand for products with copper components, such as reinforced charging cables and electrical fittings, has begun to fall, despite the seasonal peak in sales. Buyers are postponing repairs, unable to understand why they have suddenly become so expensive.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
When America imposed a 50% tariff on copper, the administration hoped that it would serve as a shield, a tool to protect domestic producers and a catalyst for industrial revival. However, after just a few months, it has become clear that instead of a shield, the country has ended up with a trap. On paper, it all looked logical. The US consumes about 2 million tons of copper per year and produces just over half that amount. In theory, if imports were restricted, domestic companies would start investing in processing and extraction, creating new jobs and restoring the supply chain. But in practice, a different logic worked. The restriction on supplies provoked a rise in prices, and the rise in prices provoked an outflow of production and a panic flight of investment. The US found itself in a paradoxical situation. The more the country tried to isolate itself from external influence, the faster it lost control over key resources.